the general thesis that I'm unfolding or trying to argue for is that I think what we see, or what I've found at least, in looking back over the course of modern thought and politics, morality, and law, is an attempt increasingly to put new wine into old bottles, to take labels like freedom, human rights, human dignity. They are central to our tradition. Not only to our Western tradition, but to our liberal tradition in the best sense of the word liberal. To take those labels, those traditional labels, and fill them with new meaning. So freedom now becomes what the compatibilists call freedom, for example, the freedom and determinism debate. Rights, human rights become, well, international human rights as we've agreed upon in some Rawlsian sense. The point is, once again, we're using old labels because those old labels are doing important work, but they don't mean what they once did. And so I think that we're sort of really confronted with this conflict. I don't know how far I'll say. I get talking, and I'm a professor, so I can do it all night. But are we anywhere near? It's 7:30. Okay.
Well, could I ask you to maybe take that forward? You have a number of Catholic justices on the court who presumably have different lineup variously on that spectrum. Can you comment on that? What that means?
You know, this is interesting. For the first time in the Supreme Court's history, there's no Protestant on the Supreme Court. Now, before 1915, it was only Protestants. Justice Brandeis was the first Jewish appointee. Justice Frankfurter was his successor, the so-called Jewish seat, but it was only one. And then at some point, mid-20th century, there were some Catholics appointed, but there have always been, of course, always been dominated by Protestants, and only with Justice Stevens retiring, I believe it was, for the first time do we have 6 Catholics, and 3 Jews on the court. Certainly with Justice Alito, Justice Scalia, who's one of his sons is a Catholic priest, Justice Roberts is Roman Catholic, Justice Kennedy is Catholic, though again, not all of the justices share the same political and legal ideology, but in a very general way, their Catholicism has shaped their view, and it isn't even necessarily a natural law view. Justice Scalia is not a natural lawyer, at least as he believes what he's doing on the court. He's much more of a positivist, but I think the natural law is in the background in a couple of provocative ways. So I do think that there's something in the nature of their background, their learning, their upbringing, and most importantly, their worldview that informs the way they think of law. And let me tell you what I think the most basic thing is. There's a big debate now about what we even mean by law. And about 10 years ago, Justice Scalia and Justice Breyer both published books on their particular theories of constitutional interpretation. What was striking about them is that Breyer's view, which is again kind of a classic liberal, it's a modern liberal view of Constitution as evolving standards, is very forward-looking. Constitutional values like equal protection, he said, are aspirational, they look forward. For Justice Scalia, it was all about grounding the law in tradition and in history. It was a very, in a sense, backward-looking idea. They just have completely different, they're almost moving in different directions. And I think their views of law really do emanate from their own particular worldviews.
But you were suggesting this road, this fork in the road, or whatever.
Right.
I was sort of picking up a sort of hopefulness in terms of maybe retrieving.
Hopefulness or hopeless?
Hopefulness. And so, do you see any of that?
You're more optimistic than I. No, I
misheard you.
Well, the fork in the road in terms of having to come to terms finally with whether we are going to draw the consequences from a more materialistic or a more God-centered worldview. In that sense, we're at sort of a fork in the road. Can we make sense of freedom and liberty, freedom of choice and liberty and human dignity from this worldview, materialistic worldview? Is it possible? And what I was sort of suggesting is what many of our most important recent political and legal and moral thinkers have been doing, what the modern project really is doing, is showing how we can save these labels by injecting newer meanings into them that are more consistent with materialism. We're going to use the labels. John Stuart Mill says freedom is not inconsistent with determinism. And then he defines freedom in a compatibilist sort of way.
Which means what?
Well, that freedom simply means, the compatibilist says, freedom and determinism are consistent. So you're free as long as you get to do what you want to do, even if what you want to do is completely causally determined. So, I mean, if you go to the lunchroom and you pick chocolate cake rather than cherry pie, even though we can trace the reasons for your choice back to your genetics and your environment and all the precipitating causes in your background. And so we can say, well, from the beginning of time, Dr. Casperson was predisposed to pick chocolate cake. You'd still be free in Mill's view, the compatibilist view, as long as you're basically doing what you want, even though that choice itself is sort of predetermined. The more robust conception of freedom, where you're not free for the compatibilist, is when you're compelled or forced to do something you don't want to do. The non-compatibilist view of freedom requires a lot more. This would get us into a big discussion about this because there are lots of problems, but the bottom line is the non-compatibilist idea is that no, when we say somebody's free, we mean when somebody murders someone, to take a horrible example, we hold them responsible because they could have done otherwise. And if you're telling me they couldn't have done otherwise, that they were determined to do this from the beginning of time in some sense, physically determined to do this from the beginning of time, how can we hold them responsible in the moral sense of holding them? Maybe we'll put them away to keep them out off the street because they're dangerous, but how can we hold them responsible? What I'm calling the traditional idea of freedom, I think, requires some sense in which, and this is the mystery, in which it was possible for us to say, I did this, but I could have done otherwise, and not simply in some diminished sense of could have. I really could have done otherwise if I wanted. John Locke, by the way, getting back to sort of Locke's own meanderings, Locke wrote this letter. Somebody accused him. He denied that he had written the second treatise. It came out after his death, but a friend of his realized that it had to be him, and he said, how could you have written both of these books at the same time? And they got into a back and forth, and Locke said, you just have to read them apart then. And he later wrote a letter to a friend where he said, and this is a close paraphrase back to the freedom thing, he said, if God can make a free act, I see not the way of it. Because ultimately, freedom itself is an incredibly mysterious thing. We can't make sense of it in cause and effect terms. Thinking about things as the materialist does. It is a very strange idea. And it can't be thought, freedom in that robust sense is inseparable from a concept of the self or soul. And you can't really unpack the idea of what it means to be free without thinking about what it means for the self to be free. Yeah.
With respect to, like I said, for about 100 years prior to Nuremberg, natural law was being sort of bashed and replaced by positivism. Of course, since then, we've definitely seen a resurgence in both philosophy and especially theology. So I'm curious with in law, despite the Catholicism of the majority of the Justice Supreme Court, among lawyers in general, do you find yourself arguing an uphill battle for a robust recovery of natural law in the classical sense?
Yeah, and this is where, back to the theme of the evening, the importance of philosophy. What I find is that, first of all, if you say the word natural law, people immediately go to sleep. Oh my goodness, really? You're trotting out that old dog, right? But if you begin asking questions, and this is what the good philosopher does, if you begin asking questions, well, so let me ask you something. When Iran does not permit religious freedom, is there a right there? And if the person, as they usually will, yeah, there's a human right, everybody. Well, but if there are only rights, if rights are simply a reflection of those things that the regime will recognize legally, they don't have a right. And then inevitably you lead the person back to the idea that there has to be for there to be a right in the more robust sense, there has to be a transcendent foundation by which positive rights of particular regimes are measured. So to answer the question, this is where philosophy comes in. It's because people are not drawing the consequences of their worldview. They often don't know where they stand on these basic things, but you begin to ask, well, what do you really believe? And doesn't this lead to this? Isn't the implication here? And I've had conversations with people who originally would go to sleep with the mention of the word natural law, but at the end of the day, I have a very good friend, in fact, I managed to convince, at least this far, that there is an objective moral reality. He's a law professor at another school, initially, but it took many backgammon games to do that. So that's why philosophy is important. People don't draw, as Murdoch said, the consequences. They say, I'm sure everybody's had this experience, a very common experience. As soon as you say, well, I don't believe in God, but I think there's something. Okay, well, what is the something? Is the something conscious of us? And depending on how they answer, you lead them back down the path to sort of question their own assumptions. I don't believe in, I'm spiritual, I don't believe in God, but I believe in karma, really. So you think the universe is so morally fine-tuned that every time somebody is wrong, they're punished for it, but who made the universe like that? You sort of confront people with the disconnect in their own worldview, their own failure to, again, draw their consequences.